Black man removed from first class for white CEO. 9 minutes later, everyone was ordered off. Why was one passenger removed while everyone else ended up leaving? What could possibly happen in just 9 minutes to change everything? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the channel. If you enjoy powerful stories filled with unexpected twists, unforgettable characters, and meaningful lessons, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Your support means the world to us, and we're truly grateful that you've chosen to spend your time here today. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, if you witnessed someone being treated unfairly in public, what would you do? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, settle in, because this remarkable story begins with what seemed like an ordinary boarding process that no one on that flight would ever forget. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one standing between ordinary and unforgettable. The announcement chimed softly through Gate C-17 at Charlotte Douglas International Airport as passengers gathered beneath the bright morning lights, rolling polished suitcases across the gleaming floor while the scent of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. Business travelers glanced at their watches. Families tried to keep restless children entertained, and the steady rhythm of boarding calls blended into the familiar soundtrack of another ordinary day. Marcus Brooks adjusted the strap of his weathered leather briefcase and quietly stepped into the priority boarding line when his group was called. At 38 years old, he carried himself with calm confidence rather than flashy success. His charcoal blazer had been pressed carefully the night before. His shoes were clean though noticeably worn at the edges, and his expression reflected the kind of patience that only years of overcoming quiet judgment could create. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent with a warm smile, thanked her politely, and walked down the jet bridge without drawing attention to himself. The cool, conditioned air inside the aircraft greeted him as a flight attendant smiled, checked his seat number, and directed him toward the first-class cabin. Marcus nodded gratefully before placing his briefcase into the overhead compartment and settling into seat 2A beside the window. Outside, baggage crews guided luggage carts beneath the rising sun while the polished aluminum wing reflected streaks of gold across the tarmac. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. He leaned back, looked through the oval window, and closed his eyes for a slow breath. Across the aisle, however, another passenger had just stepped aboard. Evelyn Carter rarely entered any room unnoticed. The white CEO of Carter Dynamics wore a tailored ivory pantsuit, diamond earrings that caught every overhead light, and the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened before she reached them. Two assistants followed closely behind, balancing expensive garment bags and designer briefcases while quietly discussing the schedule waiting for her in Washington, D.C. Evelyn slowed the instant she reached row 2. Her eyes rested on Marcus for only a second before her pleasant expression disappeared. She glanced at her boarding pass, then back toward him as though something about the picture in front of her simply refused to make sense. The nearby flight attendant noticed the hesitation and stepped closer with a courteous smile. "Is everything all right, Miss Carter?" she asked. Evelyn lowered her voice, though not enough to keep nearby passengers from hearing. "I believe there's been a mistake." The attendant looked confused. "Your seat is 2C, ma'am." Evelyn barely acknowledged the answer. Instead, she tilted her head toward Marcus with a restrained smile that felt colder than the cabin air. "No," she replied quietly. "The mistake is sitting beside my seat." Conversations throughout the cabin slowed. A businessman folded his newspaper. A young couple exchanged uncertain glances. Marcus opened his eyes after hearing the words but remained seated, saying nothing. The silence that followed seemed heavier than the hum of the aircraft itself. Then Evelyn folded her arms, looked directly at the flight attendant, and spoke the sentence that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the airplane. "Remove him from first class." The flight attendant hesitated for only a heartbeat before forcing another professional smile across her face. Years of training had taught her to remain calm no matter who stood in front of her, but this moment felt unusually heavy. She leaned slightly toward Marcus and lowered her voice. "Sir, may I please see your boarding pass one more time?" Marcus nodded without the slightest trace of frustration. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, unfolded the crisp document, and handed it to her with steady hands. The attendant examined every line carefully. "Seat 2A, first class, boarding group 1." Everything matched perfectly. She looked back at Marcus, then toward Evelyn Carter, whose expression remained frozen in quiet expectation. "Ma'am," the attendant said politely, "his boarding pass is valid." Evelyn gave a faint laugh that carried no warmth. "I am sure it scans correctly," she replied. "That is not what concerns me." A few passengers pretended to look out the windows while listening to every word. Others lowered their phones just enough to watch without appearing obvious. Marcus remained completely still. He had seen this look before. It was the kind that measured people before learning their names. The kind that assumed a story without asking a single question. Yet his breathing never changed. His hands rested loosely on the armrests, and his eyes wandered briefly toward the runway where another aircraft lifted gracefully into the bright Carolina sky. Nearly 30 years earlier, his father had taught him something he never forgot. "People can decide who they think you are in 5 seconds," his father used to say. "Do not spend your life trying to change those 5 seconds. Spend it becoming someone the truth cannot erase." Marcus carried those words everywhere. They had followed him through engineering school, through late nights studying aircraft systems, through conference rooms where he was mistaken for maintenance staff before introducing himself, and through countless moments when silence proved stronger than anger. Evelyn adjusted the silk scarf around her neck before turning back toward the lead flight. "Attendant, I have a meeting with members of the Senate less than 3 hours after landing," she said. "I expect this cabin to reflect the standard your airline advertises." The implications settled over the first-class cabin like a cold draft. Nobody misunderstood what she meant, even though she never said it directly. The attendant's smile faded almost imperceptibly. She pressed the interphone button and quietly requested assistance from the gate supervisor. Less than a minute later, a middle-aged supervisor in a Navy airline blazer stepped aboard carrying a tablet. He greeted Evelyn by name before turning toward Marcus. "Good morning, sir. I understand there is a seating concern." Marcus handed over his boarding pass once again without complaint. The supervisor verified the reservation, checked the passenger manifest, then looked back at Marcus with visible uncertainty. "Your reservation appears completely correct," he admitted. Evelyn folded her arms. "Then perhaps your system needs another review." The supervisor hesitated, clearly aware that one passenger held enormous corporate influence while the other sat alone with nothing more than a briefcase and quiet confidence. The cabin grew still enough that the distant whine of baggage loaders outside could be heard through the insulated fuselage. Finally, after a long, uncomfortable pause, the supervisor inhaled slowly and spoke the words Marcus had expected long before he reached the airport. "Sir, would you mind stepping off the aircraft with me for just a few minutes while we sort this out?" Marcus looked calmly from the supervisor to the silent faces surrounding him. Then, without arguing or asking a single question, he stood, reached for his weathered leather briefcase, thanked the flight attendant for her kindness, and quietly walked toward the open cabin door, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt louder than any argument could have been. Marcus stepped out of the aircraft without looking back. The jet bridge felt strangely quiet compared to the tension he had just left behind. Cool, conditioned air drifted through the narrow corridor while the muffled hum of the aircraft engines vibrated beneath the floor. The airline supervisor walked beside him, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, I truly appreciate your patience," he said carefully. "We just need a few minutes to resolve the concern." Marcus offered a calm nod. "Take the time you need." There was no bitterness in his voice, only the steady confidence of someone who had learned long ago that dignity was not something another person could take away. As they reached the boarding podium, the supervisor contacted operations while another employee reviewed the passenger manifest for a third time. Every record remained exactly the same. Marcus had purchased the ticket legally. His identification matched perfectly. His frequent flyer status qualified him for priority boarding. There was no policy violation, no paperwork error, and no security concern. Still, the delay continued. Through the large windows overlooking the ramp, Marcus watched orange safety vehicles move between parked aircraft while baggage handlers loaded the final containers beneath the cargo hold. A fuel truck slowly rolled away from the airplane that had become the center of an argument no maintenance crew even knew existed. The morning sun reflected across the polished fuselage, making the aircraft appear almost untouched by the tension inside. Marcus glanced toward the nose of the airplane, then slowly allowed his eyes to travel along the cabin windows until they reached the forward service door. Something caught his attention. It was subtle, almost invisible from this distance, but years of experience had trained his eyes to notice details most people would never see. A ground technician finished disconnecting external power, and as the aircraft shifted almost imperceptibly under its own weight, Marcus heard a faint metallic click echo through the jet bridge. His expression changed by only a fraction. The supervisor continued speaking into his radio, completely unaware. Marcus looked again toward the forward door. The click had not sounded random. It reminded him of a training demonstration he had attended years earlier while working alongside federal investigators studying aircraft pressurization systems. During that seminar, an instructor had repeated one sentence over and over. Airplanes whisper before they ever scream. Marcus had never forgotten those words because aircraft rarely failed without warning. Small clues almost always appeared first. A sound, a vibration, a seal slightly out of alignment, a latch that settled differently than it should. None of those signs guaranteed danger by themselves, but ignoring them had ended careers more than once. The supervisor finally ended his radio call and sighed. "Operations is still reviewing everything," he explained. Marcus barely seemed to hear him. His attention remained fixed on the forward entry door as another almost inaudible metallic tap reached his ears. This time he noticed something else. A maintenance access panel beneath the door appeared to flex ever so slightly before returning to position. Most passengers would never have recognized it. Even many airline employees might have missed it during a busy boarding process. Marcus quietly stepped closer to the window, narrowing his eyes. His breathing slowed. His thoughts became methodical. The conversation inside the terminal faded into the background. He was no longer thinking about first class, about Evelyn Carter, or about the humiliation he had quietly accepted only moments earlier. He was thinking about the airplane itself. Finally, without raising his voice or showing even a hint of panic, Marcus turned toward the supervisor and spoke with remarkable calm. "Before anyone closes that cabin door," he said, "I believe your maintenance team should take another look at the forward left entry system. I sincerely hope I am mistaken, but I do not think that sound belongs there." The supervisor blinked, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. "The forward left entry system?" he repeated. Marcus nodded once. "I could be wrong, and I sincerely hope I am. But I have heard two metallic settling clicks that do not match the normal sequence after external power was disconnected. I also noticed slight movement beneath the access panel. It is unusual enough that I would not ignore it." The supervisor glanced through the terminal window toward the aircraft before giving a polite but skeptical smile. "Sir, our maintenance team inspects every aircraft before departure." Marcus returned the smile without taking offense. "I believe they do. I am simply asking for one more look." Before the supervisor could respond, his radio crackled. "Gate C-17, boarding complete. Cabin door scheduled to close in 3 minutes." He looked from the radio to Marcus, caught between procedure and instinct. Inside the aircraft, passengers were already settling into their seats. Overhead bins clicked shut one after another while the lead flight attendant completed her final cabin walkthrough. Evelyn Carter accepted a sparkling water from another flight attendant and glanced toward the open boarding door with quiet impatience. "How much longer can this possibly take?" she asked one of her assistants. "We are already behind schedule." Her assistant checked his watch. "Only a few minutes." Evelyn leaned back with visible confidence. "Good. I have wasted enough time today." At that very moment, the gate supervisor made a decision. He picked up the radio once more. "Request one maintenance technician to gate C-17 before door closure. Quick visual inspection only." The response came almost immediately. "Maintenance reports no outstanding issues." The supervisor hesitated. Marcus did not speak. He simply waited. Finally, the supervisor answered, "Understood. I still want someone here." Less than 90 seconds later, a maintenance technician wearing a reflective safety vest arrived, carrying a compact inspection kit. His expression suggested he expected to finish within moments. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. The supervisor gestured toward Marcus. "Passenger reported an unusual sound near the forward entry door." The technician looked at Marcus with professional curiosity. "You work in aviation?" Marcus answered quietly. "I have spent many years around aircraft systems." The technician nodded respectfully. "What exactly did you notice?" Marcus described the sequence carefully without exaggeration. He mentioned the timing of the metallic clicks, the slight movement near the lower panel, and the way the sound repeated after the aircraft settled under its own weight. The technician listened without interrupting. Then he slowly turned toward the aircraft outside the window. "Interesting," he murmured. "That should not repeat twice." He walked briskly down the jet bridge while the supervisor and Marcus watched through the glass. The technician knelt beneath the forward door and removed a small inspection panel with practiced efficiency. For several seconds, nothing happened. Baggage carts continued moving across the ramp. Fuel vapors shimmered above the pavement in the warm morning sun. Airport operations continued as though this were just another routine departure. Then the technician suddenly stopped moving. He leaned closer inside the opening, lifted a flashlight, and examined something hidden behind the locking assembly. His relaxed posture disappeared. He reached for his radio immediately. "Maintenance control, this is Unit 12 at Gate C-17. I need a senior inspector at my location now. Do not authorize door closure." The supervisor slowly lowered his radio, his face turning pale as he looked back toward Marcus. Marcus never celebrated, never smiled, and never said, "I told you so." Instead, he kept his eyes on the aircraft with quiet concern because he knew one simple truth that years in aviation had taught him better than anything else. When an experienced mechanic stopped sounding confident, the Real investigation had only just begun. Senior Inspector Daniel Foster arrived less than 4 minutes later, carrying a larger diagnostic case and wearing the calm expression of someone who had spent 3 decades solving problems most people never noticed. Without speaking, he crouched beside the open access panel while the first technician quietly explained what he had found. Foster listened, slipped on a pair of protective gloves, and carefully examined the locking mechanism with a flashlight no larger than his hand. The jet bridge remained silent except for the distant whine of auxiliary power units and the occasional radio transmission from the ramp below. Marcus stood several yards away, saying nothing. His attention never left the inspection. Inside the cabin, however, patience was beginning to disappear. Evelyn Carter pressed the flight attendant call button with controlled irritation. "Why are we still sitting here?" she asked. The lead flight attendant maintained her professional composure. "Maintenance is completing an additional inspection, ma'am." Evelyn frowned. "Additional? I was told everything was already cleared." Across the aisle, several passengers exchanged uncertain looks. A man closed his laptop. A mother quietly reassured her young son that they would be leaving soon. The captain's voice finally came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are completing a brief maintenance review before departure. We appreciate your understanding." The announcement sounded routine, but the captain himself was no longer convinced it was routine. In the cockpit, he watched through the side window as 2 more maintenance vehicles approached the aircraft with flashing amber lights. That almost never happened for a simple visual inspection. Outside, Inspector Foster slowly inserted a specialized measuring tool into the locking assembly. He watched the digital display for several seconds before repeating the measurement. Then he looked toward the first technician without saying a word. The younger mechanic immediately understood something was wrong. Foster picked up his radio. "Maintenance control, confirm aircraft registration." A voice answered instantly. "Confirmed." Foster continued. "I need engineering support at Gate C-17 immediately. Possible abnormal tolerance in the forward left entry lock mechanism." The supervisor standing beside Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "How serious is that?" he asked quietly. Foster remained focused on the inspection. "I do not know yet," he answered honestly. "That is exactly why this aircraft is not moving." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm and respectful. "May I ask one question?" Foster looked up. "Go ahead." Marcus pointed toward the lower hinge assembly. "Has anyone checked whether the retaining guide shifted under load after external power removal?" Foster paused for just a moment before shining his flashlight deeper into the compartment. Seconds passed. Then his expression changed. "Well," he whispered almost to himself, "that would explain the second click." He reached farther inside and carefully touched a narrow metal guide that appeared perfectly normal to everyone else watching through the glass. It moved slightly beneath his fingertips. Not much, barely enough for an untrained eye to notice, but it was enough. Foster slowly stood and exhaled. "Close the inspection panel," he instructed the technician. Nobody touches this airplane until engineering signs off. The supervisor stared at him. Should we continue boarding on schedule? Foster looked directly toward the aircraft before answering with complete certainty. Absolutely not. He pressed the transmit button on his radio one final time. Gate C-17, notify the captain immediately. Suspend departure procedures. I am recommending full passenger deboarding pending engineering evaluation. The words echoed through the quiet jet bridge, and for the first time that morning, everyone standing nearby understood that the delay had become something far more significant than a disagreement over a seat. The captain's voice returned over the cabin speakers, quieter than before, but carrying a weight every frequent traveler recognized immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, we need everyone to gather your personal belongings and exit the aircraft in an orderly manner. Our ground team will assist you inside the terminal. Thank you for your cooperation. For a moment, nobody moved. Then seat belts clicked open almost in unison. Overhead bins swung upward as passengers reached for briefcases, backpacks, and rolling suitcases. Confused whispers filled the first-class cabin where confidence had only minutes earlier seemed unshakable. Evelyn Carter remained seated, staring toward the front galley, as if waiting for someone to explain why her carefully planned schedule had suddenly stopped. There must be some mistake, she said quietly to her assistant. Maintenance inspections do not require everyone to leave. Her assistant looked toward the windows where 3 engineering vehicles had now surrounded the aircraft. Apparently this one does. Outside the jet bridge, Marcus stood beside the airline supervisor without saying a word. The supervisor finally broke the silence. I owe you an apology, he admitted. Marcus shook his head gently. You followed the information you had. That is all any professional can do. The supervisor lowered his eyes for a moment. Still, I should have listened sooner. Marcus smiled faintly. You did listen. That is why everyone is walking off that airplane instead of flying away with unanswered questions. Those words lingered between them. Inspector Daniel Foster continued speaking with engineering specialists who had connected diagnostic equipment to the forward entry system. Every few moments, another measurement appeared on a handheld display before being compared against technical specifications stored on a rugged laptop. No one rushed. No one guessed. Aviation had taught every experienced professional the same lesson. Precision always moved slower than assumptions. Through the large terminal windows, passengers gradually entered the gate area carrying the uncertainty that follows an unexpected interruption. Some searched airline applications for updates. Others called family members to explain the delay. A little girl holding a stuffed rabbit looked curiously toward the airplane and asked her father, "Did something break?" He smiled softly. "That is exactly why they are checking, sweetheart." Nearby, the lead flight attendant stepped into the terminal and immediately noticed Marcus still standing near the window. She walked toward him with measured steps. "Sir," she said sincerely, "I wanted to thank you for speaking up." Marcus looked almost surprised. "I only shared what I noticed." She nodded. Many people would have stayed silent after everything that happened. Marcus glanced toward the aircraft where engineers continued working beneath the morning sunlight. "Airplanes do not care about pride," he answered. "They only respond to facts." The flight attendant smiled quietly, understanding far more than his words alone expressed. At the far end of the gate area, Evelyn finally stepped off the jet bridge. Her polished confidence seemed noticeably smaller now as she watched maintenance crews gather around the very door Marcus had mentioned. She searched the terminal until her eyes found him standing alone beside the glass, hands resting calmly on his weathered leather briefcase. For several seconds, she simply watched him. The image refused to match the assumption she had formed only minutes earlier. Before she could take a single step toward him, Inspector Foster's radio sounded again. Every mechanic nearby stopped what they were doing. Foster listened carefully, then slowly lifted his eyes toward the aircraft. His expression revealed nothing, but the silence that followed was enough to make the entire gate area feel as though time itself had paused, waiting for the next sentence. Inspector Daniel Foster lowered the radio slowly, and every conversation in the gate area seemed to disappear on its own. He walked toward the airline supervisor with measured steps, holding a tablet that displayed engineering data collected only moments earlier. "We have confirmation," he said quietly. The retaining guide inside the forward left entry locking assembly shifted beyond its allowable tolerance. Under cabin pressurization, the door would most likely have remained secure, but the mechanism no longer met federal safety standards. This aircraft is officially grounded until the entire assembly is replaced and inspected. The supervisor exhaled deeply, almost as if he had been holding his breath since Marcus first spoke. Around them, maintenance crews immediately began placing bright red safety tags across the access panels, while engineers photographed each component before removal. The airplane that had been scheduled to depart within minutes now stood motionless beneath the Carolina sun, surrounded by specialists instead of passengers. Word spread through the terminal faster than any announcement could have managed. Travelers who had been frustrated only moments earlier now stared silently through the glass as more airport vehicles arrived. Some quietly thanked the flight attendants. Others simply stood with folded arms, absorbing the realization that a routine boarding delay had become something far more significant. Inspector Foster turned toward Marcus for the first time since the engineering report had arrived. His expression carried neither excitement nor surprise, only professional respect. "How did you recognize it?" he asked. Marcus answered with the same calm humility he had shown all morning. "I did not recognize the failure. I recognized that something sounded different." Foster nodded slowly. "Most people would not have noticed." Marcus smiled gently. "Most people were focused on boarding the airplane. I happened to be listening to it." Foster extended his hand without hesitation. "Daniel Foster, Senior Aircraft Inspector." Marcus accepted the handshake. "Marcus Brooks." Foster looked at him for another second before asking, "You said you spent years around aircraft systems. Where?" Marcus hesitated only briefly. "I work as an independent aviation systems consultant. Most of my projects involve failure analysis and safety evaluations after unusual mechanical findings." Foster raised an eyebrow. "Failure analysis?" Marcus nodded. "I also assist investigative teams reviewing aircraft system performance when manufacturers or operators request independent technical assessments." The supervisor blinked in disbelief. "You mean you investigate the exact type of issue we almost missed today?" Marcus answered quietly. "Sometimes." Before anyone could say another word, another airport employee hurried toward them carrying a tablet. "Inspector Foster," he said. "Engineering found additional were behind the retaining guide. They believe the movement had been developing for several flight cycles." Foster closed his eyes for a brief moment before looking back toward Marcus. "Then your decision to speak up may have prevented this aircraft from departing with a mechanical condition that required immediate correction." Nearby passengers had begun noticing the conversation. A businessman who had watched Marcus leave first class earlier whispered something to his wife. The young couple from row 3 exchanged embarrassed glances. Even the gate agents who had remained busy rebooking connections now looked toward Marcus with quiet admiration. Across the terminal, Evelyn Carter stood perfectly still. Every confident assumption she had carried onto the airplane that morning had dissolved beneath the weight of a simple truth. The man she had silently judged by his appearance had not argued, had not demanded respect, and had not tried to prove anyone wrong. Instead, he had quietly done what every true professional hoped to do when lives might depend on a single decision. He had paid attention when everyone else was looking somewhere else. Evelyn Carter remained where she was, surrounded by assistants who suddenly had nothing to say. The polished confidence that usually carried her through boardrooms and shareholder meetings had given way to something unfamiliar. Reflection. She watched Marcus standing near the terminal windows, speaking quietly with Inspector Foster. And for the first time that morning she saw not the jacket he wore or the seat he had occupied, but the composure that never once abandoned him. She dismissed her assistants with a small wave and walked across the gate area alone. Each step felt heavier than the last. Conversations softened as nearby passengers noticed where she was going. Marcus turned as she approached, his expression calm and unreadable. Evelyn stopped a respectful distance away. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence carried more honesty than any carefully prepared statement ever could. Finally, she drew a slow breath. "Mr. Brooks," she began, her voice quieter than it had been all morning, "I owe you an apology." Marcus listened without interruption. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly before continuing. "When I boarded that aircraft, I made a judgment before I knew a single thing about you. I allowed an assumption to become certainty, and because of that, I treated you without the respect every person deserves. There is no excuse for that. Marcus studied her face for a moment. The confidence she once wore like armor had been replaced by something far more difficult to show. Humility. You were willing to warn people who had just embarrassed you, she continued. You could have walked away. You could have said nothing. Instead, you stayed because you believed something was wrong. Marcus glanced toward the aircraft where engineers continued replacing protective covers over the open access panel. The airplane did not know who had been kind and who had not, he answered gently. It only needed someone to pay attention. Evelyn nodded slowly, feeling the truth settle deeper than she expected. You saved every person who boarded that flight, including me. Marcus offered a faint smile. The maintenance team confirmed the issue. They deserve the credit for doing their job well. Inspector Foster, who had quietly remained nearby, stepped forward. With respect, Marcus, they confirmed it because you chose to speak. The supervisor standing beside him agreed. Most people would have left after what happened. Marcus rested one hand on his weathered leather briefcase. My father always told me that integrity is measured most clearly when nobody would blame you for walking away. Those words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Evelyn felt them more deeply than she expected. She extended her hand. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Not only for today, but for reminding me that position and appearance tell us almost nothing about character. Marcus accepted the handshake with quiet grace. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction at seeing someone humbled, only simple kindness. Around them, several passengers who had witnessed the confrontation earlier began applauding softly. One pair of hands became 3, then 6, until quiet appreciation spread naturally across the gate area. Marcus looked briefly embarrassed by the attention and nodded politely before lowering his hand. The applause faded as gently as it had begun, leaving behind something far more powerful than noise. Respect freely given instead of demanded. In that quiet terminal, beneath the bright morning light reflecting across the glass, everyone who had watched the events unfold carried home the same lesson. True first class had never been about the seat. It had always been about the person. The replacement aircraft departed a little more than 3 hours later beneath a sky washed clean by the afternoon sun. Passengers boarded with quieter voices this time, offering polite smiles to the flight attendants and grateful nods to the maintenance crew standing beside the gate. Marcus accepted a new boarding pass without asking for special treatment. The gate supervisor personally handed it to him and said, Seat 2 Alpha is waiting for you, Mr. Brooks. Marcus smiled warmly. Thank you. Nothing more needed to be said. As he stepped onto the aircraft, several passengers recognized him immediately. The businessman who had quietly watched everything from the second row stood first. Sir, he said, extending his hand, thank you. One by one, others followed. Some simply nodded. Others quietly expressed their appreciation. The young father carrying his daughter smiled and whispered, Because you spoke up, she gets home safely tonight. Marcus thanked each of them with the same quiet humility he had shown throughout the day. When he reached his seat, he placed his weathered leather briefcase into the overhead compartment once again. The same window, the same row, but somehow everything felt different. Outside, mechanics completed their final walk-around while the captain personally stepped into the cabin before departure. He paused beside Marcus. Mr. Brooks, he said sincerely, on behalf of my entire crew, thank you for trusting your experience and speaking when it mattered. Aviation is built on people who choose to say something instead of assuming someone else will. Marcus looked up with a gentle smile. Everyone did their job today, Captain. The captain nodded. Perhaps. But one observation started everything. A few rows behind them, Evelyn Carter watched the exchange in thoughtful silence. Before the aircraft doors closed, she quietly walked forward and placed a small business card on Marcus's tray table. There is no obligation, she said. But if you are ever willing, I would appreciate the opportunity to learn from someone who understands leadership the way you demonstrated it today. Marcus looked at the card for a moment before slipping it into his briefcase. Learning usually goes both ways, he replied. Evelyn smiled, this time without status, pride, or expectation. I hope so. She returned to her seat as the cabin door closed with a firm, reassuring sound. Moments later, the airplane began pushing back from the gate. Through the oval window, Marcus watched the terminal slowly drift away. The bright glass reflected dozens of people moving through another ordinary afternoon, each carrying unseen stories of their own. He remembered his father's words once more. The truth does not need to shout. It only needs someone willing to hear it. As the aircraft climbed above the clouds, sunlight poured across the wings in long ribbons of gold, turning polished metal into mirrors that reflected an endless blue sky. Somewhere below, the airport returned to its familiar rhythm, another departure replacing the last, another boarding announcement echoing through another terminal. Yet for everyone who had witnessed what happened that morning, something invisible had changed. They had boarded believing that appearance explained character. They departed knowing that character reveals itself only through choices. Marcus closed his eyes as the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. Peace settled over him, not because anyone had finally recognized his worth, but because he had never allowed someone else's assumptions to define it. Sometimes justice does not arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives in quiet moments, through honest work, humble courage, and the simple decision to care for strangers who may never know your name. And in that silent truth, there was something stronger than victory. There was grace.